Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Something pretty interesting happened when I ran the numbers on our finances recently. My wife and I have already reached something called Coast Fire at 27 years old, and my wife is 26. Now, before that sounds completely ridiculous, let me explain what that actually means. Coast Fire does not mean we're retiring tomorrow. What it just means is that if the math works out, the investments we've already made could potentially grow to enough on their own to fund our retirement later on in life. In other words, the heavy lifting of our investing journey may already be done. So in this video, I want to break down the exact numbers using our real net worth, explain how inflation plays into the calculation, and show you whether we're actually on track to coast into our retirement. So let's get into the numbers. Now, firstly, what is Coast Fire? Coast Fire stands for Coast Financial Independence Retire Early. And the idea is relatively simple. You invest aggressively early on in life. Then once your investments reach a certain size, you technically don't need to contribute any money anymore. Your existing investments simply coast and compound until retirement. And from that point forward, you only need to earn enough money to cover your actual living expenses. You're no longer relying on aggressive saving to fund retirement. And that's what makes Coast Fire so powerful, because it gives you a lot of optionality. Realistically, if we wanted to, my wife and I could go part-time, therefore buying a lot more of our time back, because we only really need to work to cover our expenses. It just buys you that freedom a lot earlier in life. But I'm going to break this all down into 5 simple steps. So the first step is figuring out how much money we actually want to live on in our retirement. And for this example, we're going to assume that my wife and I would like 75 grand per year to live on in our retirement. 75 grand in this economy would afford us a relatively comfortable lifestyle, nothing too ritzy, but also we're not cheaping out and eating 2-minute noodles every night either. Something to remember is that tastes change, needs change, so that number might change as well over time, but it's a good starting point. To convert that yearly spending into a retirement portfolio size, we use something called the 4% rule. And the idea behind the 4% rule is that if you withdraw roughly 4% of your portfolio every year, your investments should last around 30 years or longer if you do it correctly. So if we want 75 grand per year, we want to divide that by 4%. And that gives us a retirement target of roughly $1.875 million invested. And that right there is our FIRE number. So if you want to do that yourself, figure out a rough estimate of what you would want to spend every single year, divide it by 0.04 or 4%, and that will give you your FIRE number. Now, moving on to step 2, accounting for inflation. When we say we want 75 grand per year, we mean 75 grand in today's dollars, because over time, inflation slowly erodes the purchasing power of money. For example, 75 grand today won't buy us the same lifestyle in 30 years. So to account for this, investors usually calculate something called real returns. And historically, the stock market has returned somewhere around 7 to 10% per year. But once you subtract the inflation number, which averages around 2 to 3% per year, you're left with a real return of roughly 4 to 5%. So to keep things conservative, for this video, I'm going to assume a 4% real return. That means all the numbers we calculate will already be adjusted for inflation. Now, step 3, let's look at our current invested assets. I present our invested numbers in our net worth updates every single month, so I will be using the same numbers for the retirement calculations in this video as I did in my previous net worth update. So if you want to check out the full breakdown for all of those numbers, I'll leave a link to you up in I believe it's this corner. But right now we have $131,000 invested into our superannuation, and that's joint. We have roughly $14,400 invested into our ETFs and shares portfolio. That gives us a total invested portfolio of around $146,000. Now, I'm currently 27 years old. If we assume retirement is around 60, that gives us roughly 33 years to compound. And that brings us to step 4, which is letting the compounding do the work. Now, if that $146,000 grows at a real return rate of around 4% per year for 33 years, it would grow to roughly 538 grand in today's dollars. And remember, that's without investing another dollar at all, just by letting the amount of money that we already have invested compound over time. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of money to retire on, but that is not the full picture. We also have home equity. And that brings us to step 5. Right now, the equity we have in our house sits around $157,000. Now, obviously, we're not planning on selling our house today or even in the near near future. We love living here. But when you're thinking about long-term retirement planning, home equity is still a really important asset to consider. Historically, property prices tend to rise over time alongside inflation and population growth. So if the housing market continues growing over the next 30 to 35 years, the value of this property and the equity we hold in it will likely be much higher than it is today. For example, if we assume a fairly normal long-term housing growth rate of around 3% per year, that's $657,000 of equity today could potentially grow to roughly $1.7 million over the next 33 years. Now, of course, that's just a hypothetical estimate. Housing markets go through cycles and nothing is really guaranteed, but there is another important factor here. By the time we reach retirement age, our mortgage should also be completely paid off. That means we would own the home outright, which removes one of the biggest expenses most people have during their working life. And when I say that mortgage will be paid off in 30 years, that is extremely conservative. Realistically, we're on track to paying off our mortgage in the next 7 to 8 years, therefore freeing up a lot of our cash flow to invest again, compounding even more. But by the time we own this house outright, at that point, we would have a lot of options. We could stay in the home and enjoy having no housing payments, or we could choose to downsize, sell the property, and invest part of that equity to help fund our retirement. So while that equity isn't investable today, it's still technically invested into the housing market, and it could very likely become a meaningful asset in our long-term retirement plan. Now, when you take a step back and look at the full picture, something interesting really does start to happen. We already have investments compounding for the next 3 decades. We have home equity that could potentially grow significantly over time, and we should also reach retirement with our home completely paid off. All of those things together start to create a really strong financial foundation. Now, does that mean that we've perfectly hit coast fire? Not necessarily. There's a lot of assumptions with this hypothetical calculation. Markets could perform a lot differently, and life expenses might shift, especially with some of the stuff that's happening in the world right now. The way that financial landscapes might change is all up in the air. But nevertheless, running this calculation shows something really important. The foundation for financial independence might already be in place. Now, why does any of this matter? The goal of all of this isn't to retire tomorrow, but the goal is flexibility and the ability to buy our time back. I say this in all of our net worth updates. Our goal is to be able to go part-time or even be work optional by the age of 40 years old. And the fact that this calculation tells us that we could go part-time and buy some of that time back for ourselves tomorrow is a super reassuring and encouraging fact. Does that mean that we're going to do it? No. We're very ambitious people and we want to see how far we can take it. And we've still got a lot of time before we hit 40. But it's definitely given us a lot of peace of mind, especially with a few overseas trips planned this year. We won't feel so bad when splurging a little bit in places. And for 2 people working in a busy emergency department, that kind of financial security is incredibly valuable. So those are the numbers behind our potential coast fire situation. And honestly, running this calculation was incredibly motivating because it shows how powerful starting early and staying consistent can be. I'd love to know in the comments, have you ever calculated your own coast fire number or just your fire number in general? And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit subscribe because I share our monthly net worth updates, investing strategy, and everything I'm learning along the journey toward becoming financially independent. Thanks so much for watching. And as always, I wish you all the best on your wealth building journey. Guys, what is up? Welcome to the end screen. I kept talking about the net worth updates that I just did. So if you want to check out that breakdown of all the numbers, it's on screen. So just click it and I'll see you over there, I guess. Cool. Thanks for watching. Anyway, bye.